Welcome to HuffPost. With me is Flavius Mihaies again. As you know, he has reported on religious freedom around the world. He has actually been to Syria. He's also been to Ukraine. He's been to lots of different parts of the world, including India, where he's done transcendental meditation. So today, Flavius, we'll call upon you to achieve that transcendental state and educate us about religious freedom in post-Assad Syria. Welcome.
Thank you, Atul. It's good to be back with you.
All right. So, for the last 50 odd years, actually a bit more, perhaps, actually it's 1970, so 54 years, when Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, took over, we had the Ba'athist party in charge. It was nominally secular, but increasingly the Assad family came to rely on Alawites. The social base of the regime shrunk. And now we have the Sunni majority back in the form of HTS, backed by Turkey, funded by Qatar, and perhaps others too. And now we have a Sunni leader yet again at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. So what happens to religious freedom now? To Druze, to Christians, and of course to Alawites, not to mention the others?
That's the million-dollar question, right? How these minorities will fare in a Syrian society where the government is confessional from a particular religious minority or majority in the case of Syria.
I mean, the leader was once a part of the Islamic State, and then he allied with al-Qaeda. So he doesn't come with the most cosmopolitan background in the world. He's no Akbar the Great.
And that's right there a big distinction with the Assad government, father and son. Both father and son came from a secular movement, political movement, the Ba'ath Party, which did allow religious minorities to practice their faith and hold on their institutions. And this page of Syrian history is now turning. And the concern of many minorities, including the Christians in Syria that I visited a few times, is how is it going to affect their freedom of religion, their social institution, their social life? And as you mentioned, Atul, just now, the pedigree, the background of that movement, HTS, and the movement around it, coming from Islamist ideology, Qaeda and Islamic State, doesn't bode very well. You mentioned al-Qaeda.
But I must interrupt and say that the Alawites were tolerant to some degree, but in 1982, when there was a rebellion in Huma, the Muslim Brotherhood rebelled. Rifat al-Assad, the brother of Hafiz al-Assad, who went on to conduct a failed coup in 1984 and was banished. Rifat, of course, under the instructions of his brother, or perhaps they were of one mind, slaughtered 20 to 25,000 Sunnis in Hama. And they did torture, they did imprison, they did execute thousands of Sunni leaders. So it wasn't as secular as they pretended to be.
Absolutely. Religious tolerance doesn't mean political tolerance. The regime did not
kill them because they were Sunnis. They killed them because they were not supporting them.
Allowed to be challenged, exactly, to be challenged politically. And the repression was pretty brutal. And we've had many testimonies of how those secular government, socialist government turned into dictatorship, whether it's Syria or Iraq.
They were also Ba'athist.
They were also Ba'athist, exactly. So they might have kept that secularism in a sense of being inclusive of those different religious communities, minorities, but it didn't mean that they were or they remained politically tolerant. And the example you just mentioned, I think, is a flagship. And its ripple effects are felt today that embolden the insurgency and rebellion against the Assad government. And of course, the current iteration of the insurgency is not strictly Syrian. It has dozens of foreign fighters and the influence of political actors, as we might discuss, and your audience knows already. But in terms, coming back to the religious tolerance, you mentioned the background of Jolani, the leader of HTS, and the other group associated with it in that took control of Syria a couple weeks ago, or majority of Syria, the largest centers of Syria, Aleppo, Damascus. With al-Qaeda, in 2015, when I visited the Christian community in Damascus, we were shelled, random shelling from the insurgents, whom my host and the folks who were going back and forth from the insurgent-held suburbs, shelling us, were telling me these were al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda operatives. So essentially, you have
so Jolani was started al-Nusra.
Sort of al-Nusra, exactly. So you have it's those people, or the current leadership in Syria comes from those groups that were shelling civilians in August 2015 when I was there in Damascus. And not to make no mistake, I could hear the fighter jets from the Assad military going on probably bombing runs, right? So it was wartime. But these groups are now in charge of the country, or the Damascus at least. And these groups were those who were randomly shelling civilians when I was there in 2015. And no one in Damascus around the time I was there and I met wanted to even think of those people coming to their neighborhoods. And it's not only in Damascus. I visited the village of Sadnaya near Homs, where al-Nusra briefly took control of the village and killed Christians, stole property, and so they had no hope, or the Christians I met in Syria didn't see any opening, any opportunity in the oppositions as it stood, meaning the al-Qaeda oppositions. But today they are in control of the country. So it's not an easy situation, to say the least, for Christians in Syria today, and for minorities in general. When you look at the track record of HTS, al-Qaeda when in control of the government.
And as we speak, there are huge demonstrations in Syria demanding protection for Christians. Apparently, there has been an incident over Christmas tree burning, and that's all over the newspapers everywhere.
Right. And that shouldn't be surprising, understanding the reality and the behavior of those groups in Idlib, where HTS was in charge.
And HTS, for those of you who don't know, is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This is the Islamist faction that is backed by Turkey, supposedly funded by Qatar, and that has toppled Bashar al-Assad, who's fled to Moscow. The Assad family, father and son, ruled Syria for over 5 decades.
Right. And this group was in charge of running, was in power in Idlib, that enclave, that is with the support of Turkey. The Assad military was not able, but also it was part of the Assad agreement, part of the agreement to cease the fighting and to find a non-violent resolution of the conflict that began in 2013. This group was Jolani was in charge of Idlib. So when you look at the track record of running Idlib, you have allegedly only 2 Christians left in Idlib.
Because they are too old to leave.
Probably. Campaigns against non-Sunni groups, minority, like the Shias. Billboards with message such as a woman without veil is a city without gates. So when the media...
Charming, isn't it?
It is inviting for many of, I'm sure. So when the media would tell you, well, this group has reformed, well, the track record is right there. You could see how reformed they were days before they went on and took control of the rest of the country. Plus the question of the group reform, perhaps, but many of those fighters, a lot of those fighters, they are ideologically motivated, driven. Some might be gun for hire, but many of those al-Qaeda and Nusra, it's an ideology. And can you switch an ideology the way you change your car? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And again,
you mean to say it's not easy to change ideology? Mercenaries can be bought, mercenaries can be managed, but ideologues are difficult to handle. They are difficult to change, if not impossible to change.
Which makes the claim that they reform also to take with caution, given the very nature of those groups, which are, as you say, ideologically and ideologically do not change ideology the same way you would change your shirt.
Jolani had a bounty of $10 million on his head.
Right. That I think was taken off by the State Department after his group took control of Syria. And similarly with the Kurds, in the east, but also there are Kurdish presence in Aleppo. There has been that long confrontation between the American-backed Kurds and their ally, the Syrian Democratic Forces. I visited Manbij in 2016. Manbij is in eastern Syria, which was the limit between the American-supported Kurdish and their ally forces and the Turkish-backed rebels, which included groups like HTS. And those Kurdish and Arab fighters and folks that I met didn't want to live under HTS, under radical, what they saw as radical Islamic governments. And no, Manbij actually fell. So there are questions about what's the situation of those there in that city, what's the situation of the Kurds who are being overrun by HTS.
The Kurds, it's not a religious issue because the Kurds are Sunni. The Kurds do not have a different faith. There, the problem is more ethnic, and also Turkey. Turkey wants to destroy the armed groups in northeastern Syria.
So beside the Turkish aspect, which is indeed a significant one that complicates the Kurdish situation in Syria, it's not religious, but the Kurds would tell you that in radical Islam, in Islamist ideology, there is no place for national aspiration. There is no space for political identity.
Everyone is one ummah. All
Right.
Muslims
And you can,
form one ummah.
if you come up with the political identity or claims, then you're crushed. There is no space for that. So it is also one of the reasons that the Kurds didn't find there was no fit for the Kurdish cause and the Islamist rebel in Syria, whether it's the Islamic State or al-Qaeda and Nusra.
Well, they have bitter history because the Kurds proved to be key fighters against al-Qaeda and against, in particular, against Islamic State.
And when you look at the institutions, the civil institution, the civil administration in the Kurdish-controlled eastern Syria that I visited a few times, these could be at home in Germany or Scandinavia, very gender balance. The mayor, it's a co-mayor. You have co-mayors in Kurdish-controlled cities, a man and a woman. You have women only and women-led fighting brigades, fighting platoons in the Kurdish forces. So that's not something that goes well with HTS Islamist governance or ideology.
Got it. So though they may be Sunni, but it's a very different form of Islam, and that form of Islam is unacceptable to HTS.
It is more so that the strong political identity that you have within the Kurds in Syria doesn't have a place in the Islamist ideology as it is with HTS and other groups in Syria today.
So, what next?
Someone say that it's hard to predict the future. It's even harder in the Middle East. But of course, the situation doesn't depend only on the internal actors.
So, who are the external actors?
The external actors, of course, you know them very well, and our audience know Israel, Turkey,
Turkey,
United States, Iran to a lesser extent, and Russia to a lesser extent as well. It is, I think, arguably, Russia quickly understood that the investment needed to keep the Syrian army able to fend off this latest campaign against Assad was too high, and the priorities is in Europe. And also historically Russia is not as focused on geography, on territorial gains, and you can see that with the way they are fighting and they fought in Ukraine or even Second World War, even under Napoleon. So losing ground doesn't bother so much. It's more of all the strategic, like attrition or bigger strategic pictures that matter than holding on to a piece of land. So it's not surprising to me, knowing a bit of the way Russians see war, that it was not a hard decision to give up on the Syrian territory that they were, invited by the Syrian government helping hold.
Okay, so we've talked about the external players. Turkey obviously wants a return to influence. Before we began the podcast, we were looking at the MIT site. Now, those of you who are thinking of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I'm afraid we have to disappoint you. We are not that bright. Both Flavius and I would never have got into MIT. I think I can say that safely on your behalf as well.
Certainly on my behalf.
Exactly.
I'm sure I would
No, I wouldn't have. Let's be honest.
shining
No.
there like we did with at Oxford and other prestigious.
I could have done Oxford, but I can't do maths, so no MIT. But the MIT we were looking at is Milli İstihbarat Teşkilatı, which is the Turkish intelligence. And apparently the first chap to enter Damascus, and you can find his videos on YouTube, was the big boss of MIT. And so clearly Turkey wants de facto control over some parts of Syria, squash the Kurds, maybe even have Aleppo back. After all, Aleppo lies on the route to Constantinople, now called Istanbul. So Turkey's goals are clear. Sunni players like Qatar would, they backed the rebels against the Assad regime. They would like to continue backing. I'm sure UAE and Saudis too have their favorites there. Israel has already taken over Golan Heights, and the Druze are asking the Israelis to give them protection. They want the Israelis to be protectors of the Druze, and the Druze have historically close relations with Israel, and they are not entirely at ease with Jolani and HTS. So Iran, as you said, is weakened. Russia is weakened. And of course, there is the US. What does the US want? Because the president-elect Donald Trump, has declared that Syria is a hot mess and the US should stay away from it.
Well, just on Turkey, you mentioned the view and the even physical presence of the intelligence service in Damascus right away after the fall of Assad. Coincidentally, before the attack of HTS and the fall of Damascus earlier this month, I was rereading a book called The Battle of Aleppo.
Aha! What a relevant book.
That book is about the many battles for Aleppo that took place in the 12th century, where between the Crusaders and the Turks. And Aleppo was already then at the center of the struggle for control of that region. So it should come as no surprise that almost 1,000 years later, you still find the Turks there working to plant their flag on Aleppo. So it makes sense historically. And another telling anecdotes, 2 weeks ago at the National Press Club, I ran into a fellow journalist who works for a large Turkish.
Oh yes, I know who you're talking about.
And he greeted me very excitingly, and I said, "What's up?" And he said to me, "Turkey made history. That Syria is part of the Turkish zone of influence of interest is well documented." It's no surprise.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Damascus has gone from the Iranian sphere of influence to the Turkish sphere of influence. That's a huge thing.
Right.
And the rivalry between the Ottomans and the Safavids goes back 500 years, and between the Turks and the Persians goes back more than 1,000 years, I suppose.
Right. And if you add now the recent Kurdish dimension to it, it makes it even more urgent, arguably, for Turkey to assert control about that region. I mean, once and for all control, right? Not to let that what they see as an open sword, having a autonomous armed Kurdish region right at their border. Although the relation between the Kurds and the Turks, as you know, is much more complicated and not and nuanced. Needless to say, in the early 2000s, Erdogan was having discussions with Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdish independence or autonomous movement, in order to find a resolution to that conflict between some of the Kurds or some of the Kurds and Turkish government.
Look, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is far more tolerant of the Kurds than Mustafa Kemal Atatürk Pasha, because Turkish nationalism in the Kemalist Republic had no space for the Turks. So yes, it was a secular country, it was a secular nation state built in the European model, but it absolutely hammered out any form of dissent on the part of the Kurds, and his own adopted daughter was the first female fighter pilot bombing the Kurds.
no surprise here. But the fact of the matter is having that autonomous Kurdistan in a country that Assad was not able to get back under central control,
Mhm.
central state control, was a problem for the Turks, and I think it certainly helped explain why they had so much invested into supporting HDS and other groups to assert their influence in that part of Syria. But the Kurdish question is somehow separate here because of its connection with Turkey. But the question for religious minorities is still very much open, and many would say is very preoccupying because you take the Christians under different iterations of the governments, the country in the Levant, they have faced persecution, destruction, and attrition as people flee. And I have met many Christians who decided to leave the country even after the fighting stopped or largely stopped in 2017. The sanction regime, the so-called Caesar sanctions, suffocated Syria, all Syrians, including especially perhaps it's innocent civilians. You could not make any transactions online. De facto, you were being starved. You couldn't access many goods, essential goods or services, and so many decided to leave. And when you have a population that's prior to the war, to the Arab Spring, was 10% of the population, so it's about 2 million Christians in Syria prior to 2011. There were 10 years ago when I wrote that, when I visited Damascus and I wrote that first piece about the Christian in Damascus. The EU Parliament, the European Union Parliament, has estimated that about 40% had fled. That was 10 years ago. I'm certain that many, many, many more fled. And so now you fast forward 10 years later and you have a Islamist government, those Islamist movement in charge of the country or part of the country, or certainly regions where the Christians are living as a minority, and that come from the same group that were bombing and kidnapping and killing minorities, including Christians. It's not clear if they will survive as a population group in Syria for much longer. It will be a loss. It will be a loss for Christianity. The church was started in Syria. The Syrian Christian would
Of course, Paul had a Damascene conversion.
I took that road from Lebanon to Damascus, and then my hotel was on the Al-Mustaqim, which is the straight road in Damascus where Paul recovered his eyesight, right? And how can you tell me that Jesus was born in Palestine, but Christianity started in Syria? And so,
But I mean, you could argue this is part of the long loss of Christianity in the Middle East, because after all, this was all part of the Byzantine Empire. First part of the Roman Empire, then part of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, and then, of course, after a period of time, the Byzantines lost to the expanding Arab Empire, and then, of course, the Arab Empire retreated and the Ottoman Empire took over. So you could say, well, this has been part of a centuries-long trend. Christianity has been in retreat in the region.
It's been part, but part of the success of the Ottoman political organization was that they would let communities exist and live there according to their rules, right, and the practices. The Miye, M-I-L-E-T, normally pronounced in English. But when you have some millet in English, and that's the concern of those minorities. But when we have a confessional government, say a radical Sunni government that does not has a room that's placed for minorities to practice their religions freely, then you face destruction and attrition way more than under the pre-existing regime, that system that you mentioned. And that's what's at stake here in Syria today. The fear of a confessional regime, confessional government that will even attrite, destruct or attrite the few remaining Christians. But it's also a loss for Syria as a society, as a mosaic, as a plural, multicultural, multi-religious society that give its strength, right, and its richness. And that's also what.
Let me ask you: does Syria even exist? After all, I mean, you're French. You grew up in France. After all, Syria is a product of Sir Mark Sykes and Monsieur Georges Picot drawing lines on the map. And do those lines even make sense?
Right here, and that's a good question, right? You're absolutely right on the political dimension. I use the Syrian as a society, as a Syrian society.
Or the communities that exist within the current borders of Syria.
Within the current region, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's because, of course, Russia has been at the crossroad of Syria. Sorry, has been at the crossroad of the region there, and ruled by different bigger entities, and being at the very crossroad. I think is it the souk in Aleppo is the oldest continuously running bazaar souk.
I would have to check.
It's a very
but if it is, I wouldn't be surprised.
Exactly. So having one particular religious government, a form of governance that crowds out or tried or destroyed the other founding cultures and identities of Syria would be a loss for the region. And of course, a loss, as we say, for Christianity, given its that region is the birthplace of Christianity.
I see. So, any parting thoughts? You painted a dim view, a dark picture. Any parting thoughts, Flavius?
It's Christmas Eve, at least in
Washington,
the Western world. But it's I think our thoughts should be on those minorities today in Syria. And if we care about Syria, let's care about all Syrians. For sure, there are those who rejoice, and rightly so, of the fall of a dictatorship. But when we look at the events and all the image and the bad things that government has done, let's also not lose sight about what's happening today with Syrians by those who replace the Assad government in the country.
Excellent. Well, Flavius, I wish you a very Merry Christmas. You're off to a monastery to meditate. Bonne chance.
Thank you.
Vos méditations.
Merci. Thank you. And look forward.
We'll see you in the new year when you're back.
Absolutely. Hopefully refreshed, and also wish you and your team and your audience happy holiday and restful time before what will be arguably a very busy next year as well.
An eventful 2025 for sure.
Right.
Excellent. Everyone, bye for now.